Good morning. I'm Neil Hayes, Assistant Director, Innovation, Impact and Business, and I'll be chairing this session on Research Commercialisation Landscape and the support available on your journey from researcher to entrepreneur. We've got 3 speakers during the session, and we'll conclude with a question and answer session at the end after the final speaker. So we've got our first slide, please. So earlier this morning you heard from Philippe Young about his experience with Simpleware, which spanned over 20 years from the initial research through to his eventual exit from the company. So commercialisation via a spin-out company can be a long and complicated journey, often detouring from the path you originally set out on. However, there's many other ways to commercialise your research, which is why it's important to know about and take advantage of the support available and work out what's best for you and your project. All commercialisation projects start with an idea, which then progresses through research to a prototype, which can be evaluated against customer needs, ideally generating some unique, protectable intellectual property along the way. We then come to a decision point where we have to decide the best way to commercialise and determine the team, funding and resources required to achieve this. As you can see, there are many different funding options, training and support programs we can help you access at different stages of development. I'd now like to introduce you to our panel of experts who will help guide you on your journey. Go to the next slide, please. Okay. So first we've got David Whitehouse. David's an Impact and Partnership Development Manager in Innovation, Impact and Business, and David's going to talk about translational funding and collaborating with businesses. So over to you, David.
Okay, thanks very much, Neil. If I can just get the slides up and then we can make a start. There we go. So this is the area that I wanted to focus on, the earlier stages of the research commercialisation, and certainly before we get to the point that we might consider licensing or spinning out. And I also want to touch on, as I've highlighted at the bottom here, the various research grants and particularly translational funding that might be available to you through this journey. If I can go to the next slide, please. One of the things that I do want to highlight, though, is I guess there are 2 sides to the story, 2 aspects of research commercialisation. Firstly, we've heard from Philippe about his journey towards licensing and ultimately spinning out the company Simpleware, which was obviously one pathway. But what I also want to highlight is research commercialisation in the context of working directly with business, because often there may be technologies that you've developed as an academic, method or know-how that could actually support businesses to solve a particular problem or a challenge that they might have. If I can just go to the next slide. What I'll do, though, is really begin to talk about the translational funding side of the equation. And I suppose when I think about my role, I can think about it in the context of working with non-academic partners and being able to facilitate that dialogue with you, that collaboration, and through the various applications. But what I'm really particularly trying to focus on is identifying the right funding with the right partner at the right time. And not necessarily in that order, but to do that, it is worth thinking about where your idea or the stage of development of your technology is, and where do you hope to progress your technology to during that particular project, and what does a successful outcome really look like? And also, if the project is successful, who's the most appropriate funder to support the next stage of that development? And if there's one, how might we decide which funder or indeed which partner we might want to choose. And so beginning to think about some of those questions and answering those questions, I think is quite important to understand who we might be approaching, to look at who the right funders are, who the right partners are, and what's the right time. Can I go to the next slide, please? So when I think about choosing the right funding, it is actually quite an interesting landscape. And what I've tried to illustrate here is some of the principal sources of translational funding in healthcare technologies. And as you will see from the left-hand side bullets, there are some small amounts of money which aren't actually illustrated on this slide. But these are some of the university's seed corn funds, which I think we're going to touch on later in the presentation. Open innovation funds, which again can start kickstarting an idea or even sponsoring collaboration with partners. But also you will see that there's a number of Research Council follow-on grants, such as the EPSRC IAA, the Impact Acceleration Account. And then there's the MRC, and then the MRC CIC, which I think is very similar to the IAA. It's a follow-on developmental piece of funding. But then you have the Research Councils. One of them that I would highlight is the NIHR, that have much bigger development grants under their Eye for Eye scheme, which is Invention for Innovation, and there's a particular one called the Product Development Award. But there are others as well. There's the Innovate UK funding, and also the biomedical catalyst. So you can see there that there's quite a span of funding available, and sometimes it's tricky to think about which is the most appropriate vehicle. But when you look at this, it puts into context where that funding might be in relation to where your particular project is. So at the very early phase of basic and applied research, there are some funding mechanisms there, but later on, as you get towards perhaps clinical evaluation and regulatory approval or adoption and diffusion, other funding vehicles come into play. The other thing to note is that depending on the funding vehicle, they are either led by an investigator, or they can actually be led by a business. In reference to the UK SMART grants, for example, these are business-led in collaboration with investigators, whereas something like the MRC DPFS is actually investigator-led, potentially with a partner. So it's important to understand that, because there is then different criteria and rules that come into play. But hopefully that gives you a sense of what that landscape looks like in relation to how the technology readiness level might influence who it is that we might be looking to fund the particular project. I've just noted at the bottom there, I've highlighted the knowledge transfer network, and there's a link there, and I know these slides will get shared later, but that actually is a really good place to find out what these funding opportunities are. And I also had landed in my inbox just earlier on this morning that there's a new UK research and innovation website, and they've got a very, very neat way of being able to navigate your way around some of these funding options. If I can go on to the next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, because this is also another large pot of money that's overseen by Innovate UK. And the industrial strategy is fundamentally the government's intent as to what we will look like by 2030 through an increased investment in R&D, infrastructure and skills. And this was kicked off in 2017 with a 4.7 billion investment over 7 years. And whilst, yes, we are approaching 2021, what I find particularly interesting is that some of the waves that are coming through the industrial strategy are still relevant. It's a huge amount of investment. And I guess what we're looking towards is understanding what this might look like post-Brexit and also in the new normal. And what I have seen through even the Southwest LEP, the local enterprise plan, that there is a real big focus on the recovery through COVID-19. And there's a lot of investment that will relate to how we can collaborate with companies going forward. If I just go to the next slide, I can just expand briefly on the industrial grand challenges. And within this investment, there are, I think it's something like 22 grand challenges, but they are bucketed into 3 key areas. But there's a backdrop and an infrastructure around artificial intelligence and data economy, which is a thread across all of these themes. And the ones that we might be more interested in relate to aging society. And there are 4 key grand challenges related to the aging society. One is data to early diagnosis and precision medicine, accelerating detection of disease, the healthy aging agenda, and leading edge healthcare. And all of those 4 themes are relevant, and we will see continued investment and money in those areas. And I think one of the most ambitious projects, which I only heard about a couple of weeks ago, was in the area of accelerating detection of disease, where there's a pioneering program to recruit 5 million volunteers into a research study, which is going to help with the aim of really inventing new ways to detect and prevent development of disease earlier on. So that's going to actually be an interesting one to watch, along with funding coming into that as well. If I can just go on to the next slide, I want to touch on really finding the right partner. And I guess this relates very much directly to the kind of support that you might need for the project. And there are a number of reasons along that journey as to exactly what type of help and support that you might need. And I've tried to bucket some of them, but it could range from very early human factors testing to oversight of the regulatory and compliance around perhaps developing a medical device, to market mapping and validation. So really understanding exactly what that criteria is important. But finding the right partner can be a challenge. And what I've got to say about that is that it's probably harder today than it was pre-COVID, because if you want to go fishing in the right small fishing ponds, often you would go to some conferences and you'd be able to identify and hook up with R&D colleagues from industry and build a network that way. Now, you can still do that virtually, and I would very much encourage you, to start that journey right now, even before a project starts, in many ways, because building a relationship ahead of the point where you might be inviting them to be a partner on a specific research grant or translational funding is actually very beneficial. So to find the right partner, fishing in the right areas, building that network, but also using the power of social media can actually help in promoting your research and your technologies. If I go to the next slide, the reason for me to highlight this was that the right partner could come from any particular area, and I think we've already touched on that. It may well be a function of the type of support that you need, but it's worth bearing in mind that there is quite a broad span of support that you could potentially seek. In terms of the SMEs, there are plenty of SMEs that would be happy to support certain translational research projects, but very often we find that they don't necessarily have deep pockets. So an expectation that they might come with, you know, large contributions would not be accurate. Whereas when you look at industry, larger industry, a couple of examples there like AstraZeneca and Thermo Fisher, then certainly deeper pockets, but they would like and probably want higher expectations of what they're actually getting. But there's some other partners there, from charities to public bodies like the NHS that are key partners, or DSTL. But in the middle spot, there's also some enabling organisations which could well be key partners. And I've pulled out some of the catapults, the Medicine Discovery Catapult, the Cell and Gene Catapult, and CPI, Continuous Process Improvement, and NPL, all represent bodies which can fundamentally give a deep level of expertise in certain key areas. And uniquely, because they are not private entities, they don't necessarily have an expectation of IP share or anything like that. They represent, I guess, a place with the interface between academia and industry, really as drivers to ensure that technologies actually do get translated and into the real world. So these are key partners. If I could go to my next slide, it's really just trying to finish up this this triangle of the right funding, the right partner, and when is the right time. And there's a little bit more detail on looking at where your project may be in context to the TRL. And it's important to have that in mind. But also at the very beginning of the journey, it's also worth checking in on the intellectual property status and the freedom to operate. And this is something that I know that Tori will probably touch on later. But the IP and the FTO is a really good starting point to understand whether or not you are on safe ground to continue with your technology development. And even if there are some things to suggest that maybe you don't have the entire freedom to operate, there are things that can be done at that early stage. But with that said, it's really important that as you go through the successive funding stages, the expectation of the technology really comes higher, and the appetite for risk almost gets lower. And so it's really worth bearing that in mind as to the timing that we might be then thinking of how we might engage with various partners. And certainly large corporates would like to see projects significantly de-risked before they might consider investing. If I could go to the next slide, I'm just going to step away now from that translational research funding. Hopefully I've given you some food for thought there. But I wanted to touch briefly on working with business, where, again, business may want to see a problem being solved or a challenge being overcome. And you might have the technology that you've developed or method or know-how that could actually help get them there. And if I could just go to the next slide. The opportunity for us as a university to really help business is extraordinary. Many of you will know that many organisations have their own research and development focus. But that said, there is often gaps in their R&D capabilities, which can really be well supplemented by the knowledge and expertise within the university environment. And that might be whether it's know-how or it could well be facilities. But also there is a great deal of knowledge within the research base that we have. And this is knowledge that we can always share with industry so that we can improve their skills and their knowledge. And there's really quite a few mechanisms to do this. And I won't go into these in detail, but I think Philippe already mentioned knowledge partner transfer. This is a partnership. Sorry, this is a partnership where there's a three-way deal between UK RI and Innovate UK, the university, and a business. There are ways that we can provide contract research services or fee for service and consultancy. And then there's some educational inputs. But one thing that I would like to draw your attention to, now I just highlighted it at the bottom, and it's really on secondments and exchanges. And I think this is a vehicle that is well worth considering. And I saw that only, I think it came through a couple of days ago, that UKRI do have an Innovation Scholar secondment in the biomedical sciences. And this is a grant for £300,000 over a period of 36 months for a secondment in industry. So that is probably one example that hopefully may be of interest to you. So that's really my final slide. If I just go to the last one and summarize, hopefully what I've been able to do is to capture, I guess, the key context of the landscape for translational funding and the type of help and support that we can provide to navigate through that landscape. But also there is that other opportunity of really working with business in a number of different ways, and all of the insights around those mechanisms we can expand on if there are opportunities that you identify. So Neil, that's it from me. If I hand back to you.
Okay, thanks, David. That was a great run through of the translational funding landscape. So just before we move on to our next speaker, if I could just encourage anybody, if they've got any questions, to please pop them into the Q&A box, and we'll come back to those at the end of this session. So moving on now from translational funding and collaborating with business, we've next got Tori Hammond, who's one of our research commercialization managers, who's going to take us through IP and commercialization. Over to you, Tori.
Thanks, Neil. Perfect, the slides are ready. So, morning everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tori, one of Exeter's 3 commercialization managers. And I've been working with Neil in IIB for a little over 4 years now. My remit broadly covers commercialization of Exeter research and IP across the life sciences, healthcare, medical devices. So I largely work with CLES, EMPS and CMH academics. If I could have the first slide, please. Or the next slide. So from Neil's introduction and David's as well, you'll know that I'm going to cover the aspects of the entrepreneurial journey indicated by the blue triangle at the bottom, from research hypothesis on the left-hand side, an ideation through to exploitation of research outputs down a commercial route, as described really nicely by Philippe earlier. Next one. So in this pretty brief session, I'm just aiming to give you a flavour of what advice and support the IIB team can give to Exeter academics whose research has commercial potential. My slides are going to need to be clicked through, I'm afraid, line by line, which is probably not best. Perfect. So before I get into the detail, lots of information is included in the IP policy on the Exeter website, so I'd really encourage you to review that as a start point. So in terms of access to IP advice, I implore you to seek our advice early, if possible. Grant funders are really now in tune to IP and expect you to consider it and its potential routes to impact throughout your applications. Many funders also have clear expectations around revenue sharing from IP exploitation embedded in their funding terms and conditions. But as with all these things, IIB and research services can support you with any queries that you might have at any stage. Should you create any IP during a research project, then you're required to report this to colleagues in IIB so that we can do the necessary evaluation, protect the university's assets, and work with you to consider the different routes of IP exploitation. And this is an obligation imposed on Exeter by research funders. And David has run through some different models of partnering really helpfully. So you know now that we can support you to access the best partners, and we'll work with legal services as necessary to put in place the right sorts of legal agreements. And that's really important so that IP is considered from the very start of a research project. Upon the realisation of IP, we can support you to look at funding opportunities, as David has nicely described, and move the research onto a higher technology readiness level, or work collaboratively with partners to move the IP into a more commercial setting. If you want to click again for me, Lisa. And again. Perfect. So we aim to support you as best we can using our in-house knowledge, internal knowledge, and also lever our external networks and supplement as best we can with giving you access to training programs. Ultimately, IIB are here to help empower you to commercialise your research as inventors. Next one, please. Perfect. So, what is intellectual property? It is an asset created in the course of research. For example, it might be materials or methods or book chapters, algorithms, software that is created in the course of research. And the University of Exeter owns the IP that is created by its employees. Next, please. IP is more than just an idea. It is an invention or a form of expression, so it's tangible, and it can be traded by its owner for commercial or societal gain. And it's really important for you to consider upfront in your funding applications and throughout the life cycle of research. It's really crucial to engage with us, and we can help support you in these considerations. Next slide. So, as we've sort of touched on already, there's numerous types of IP, and it's really helpful for this to be considered so that funders and also IIB can be aware and best support exploitation once it's created. So patents are a registered form of IP, and that's used to protect an invention. Typically, it's a composition, for example, a product, or a method of use, for example, a process. And a granted patent gives a monopoly right for up to 20 years. Some examples of this might be a new drug formulation, a diagnostic method, or a manufacturing process, for example. Next is copyright. This is an automatic, back again, sorry. Next is copyright, and that's an automatic form of IP to protect expression of language or creative works. And some examples that I see of this in the healthcare space are interventions or manuals around training materials. And then this is also how software or algorithms are typically protected. Trademarks are another registered form of IP to protect logos or brand names. So, for example, the University of Exeter's crest is a trademark. Design rights are another registered form of IP, and these protect the 3D design of a product. So an example of this might be a medical device's ergonomic handpiece, and that could be registered as a design right, obviously supplemented by other types of IP. And the last one is know-how, which can be quite hard to define, but it's typically your specialist knowledge, which is often commercialized through consultancy. But all in all, each of these forms of IP can be commercialized in their own way. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of what we're looking for when we assess whether we should protect and exploit Exeter IP, we look to determine whether it's commercially viable when it's disclosed to us. So firstly, the intellectual property must be protectable, which in the case of a patent, it means for a patentable invention, you can't have presented this innovation at a conference or published a paper or discussed this in a public forum ahead of formal IP protection being lodged. Hence, again, I implore you, please come and talk to us as early as possible. We're happy to give informal advice ahead of time, or fill in an online disclosure form and the IRB team will review this and come back to you. Next. Second, the IP must be commercially viable. So a cost-benefit analysis would be needed to understand the demand for the IP. You know, what is the need for your research outputs? And Philippe talked about the importance of understanding the breadth of your markets that the tech might apply to as one example. So to help us consider the potential demand, if you could click again, I kind of ask that you consider or ponder these sorts of questions. The slides will be circulated afterwards, but ideally you would get answers from potential customers as opposed to making assumptions, as quite often happens. Next. And finally, the IP would be realizable. So having protected IP that is desirable is excellent, but for example, if it costs £1 million to make but only sells for £10, then that's not so viable. And Philippe really nicely described the scalable nature of some software models earlier. So to give you a sense, these are the sorts of questions that we would run through with you in evaluating the IP at an early stage, but also have input from potential partners, for example, in the supply chain or customers. Pick again for me. Oh yeah, some other considerations there. Okay. Next slide. So to give you an idea of the support available to researchers seeking to commercialise your research, my advice is to talk to us early. David and I and the whole team work really closely together, so talk to either of us, both of us, anybody across the department. We'll happily connect you with other professional services like the legal team. If we need agreements drafting, you know, we're here to help you on this journey. Next. So we obviously have colleagues within IIB with a broad range of expertise, having worked in industry ourselves. We also have access to entrepreneurs in residence through different funding schemes, and Roger will talk this afternoon, as well as seeking advice from internal colleagues as well. You know, people like Philippe are great sources of information and advice. Next. IIB's remit is to connect with external partners so that we can signpost, make introductions to suitable external partners that have expertise in the right areas. So for example, David mentioned the Medicines Discovery Catapult, but IIB has a roster of associates that we can draw on to give access to specialist knowledge or consultancy support, and that might be anything ranging from medical device certification, design, you know, regulatory approval, or medicinal chemistry, for example. Next. Market research is really important, and Philippe nicely highlighted that earlier too. And one example of a market research program is iCure. We've had great success in iCure programs. These are run across 3 different universities nationally now. Exeter has had 25 awards to be part of this program, and this has led to 10 new companies spinning out of Exeter, so to date. Lorna Harries will talk after lunch about her specific example and experience working on iCure. She got first-hand market research on her own research technology, commercial viability across different sectors in different geographies, and the scalability of the tech. And that program and all programs are really valuable in opening doors to new partners and investors. As well as these sorts of programs, we can lever our contacts and get paid for services to get market research done outside of iCure. So In Part is a online portal that we can use to seek feedback from the market, as well as our IRB associate list who are already embedded in industry. Next. Internal funding is really important, and it helps de-risk the technology further, as David's talked about. So it can take the research into a much more commercial setting, and we've got lots of funding schemes in-house. So an IRB and research services can help signpost you to the most suitable programs. Next. And all the above can kind of lead down towards enterprise fellowships, which are specific fellowships that can be used to directly enhance research outputs towards commercialization. For example, Royal Society and BBSRC enterprise fellowships. And the last one. And everything above kind of leads to a cumulative process of embarking on potentially a SETsquared program, and Joe's going to talk straight after me about those, so I won't steal his thunder. Next slide. So once we've realised commercially viable and valuable IP, there's a number of different commercialisation routes. So know-how is often used to deliver consultancy projects, fee-for-service contract research, or knowledge transfer partnerships. And as David's touched upon, it's really important to get the right partner, and we can help you find different external partners or collaborators, as well as negotiating the commercial arrangements and have agreements drawn up to govern the relationship and the outputs of the project, such as the IP. Next one. Patents and copyright can be licensed to one or more partners, where Exeter retains ownership of the IP, but it's exploited by a partner in exchange for a revenue share or royalty payment. One example of this is a psychological intervention developed at Exeter in psychology. And we've licensed the copyright to an e-health company, Mind District. They then deliver the intervention into the NHS and IAP services for a fee, and a proportion of that revenue flows back to the university. Next. So all forms of IP have the potential to be exploited through incorporation of a new company, a spin-out company. Whilst this route isn't always suitable, for example, we might consider licensing if there's existing companies in the space that are well established or control the lion's share of the market. However, if there's not, we may work with you to spin out a new company or start up a new company. And then we can source funding, so angel, venture capital or grant funding, as well as supporting you to build a team and license in any Exeter IP in exchange for equity. And I've listed a few examples on the right-hand side there of Exeter spin-out companies across engineering, medicine and the life sciences. But as I say, the Exeter IP policy is a really good reference point, and we're always available to you for ad hoc advice at any stage. Just get in touch. Next slide. And finally, I wanted to leave you with the sentiment that Neil touched upon at the beginning, that whilst we're here to help and support researchers on your own entrepreneurial journey, it's not linear and it's not a race, but rather it's a unique process to each of you. There's no manual or formal process. So in a way, it's a bit like research, but we're here to help guide you and support you and help answer any questions that you might have. So if there are any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll answer those in the Q&A shortly. Neil, that's me done. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Tori. It's good to see some examples there, including a previous ISSF company in Eurognostics. I had a look at their statistics recently, and John's raised nearly £1 million now in non-dilutive grant funding through the company. So it shows you what can be achieved by spinning out. Our next speaker is Joe Pearce, and Joe's going to talk through the support that's available through SETsquared Exeter, and this is really focusing towards the stage when the decision to spin out's been made, and we're looking to develop and grow a business. So Joe, over to you.
Many thanks, Neil. Good morning, everybody. So yes, as Neil says, my name's Joe Pearce, and I am Head of Business Support in the Regional Engagement team within IIB, and I lead the SETsquared Exeter programme. So, as has been alluded to, we provide entrepreneurship support on campus for students and researchers who are interested in exploring an entrepreneurial pathway. And we also provide business acceleration services, which are headquartered at the Exeter Science Park Centre. And over the coming 15 or 20 minutes, what I'd like to do is briefly introduce the SETsquared partnership and the range of services that we deliver through SETsquared Exeter, and how that partnership hangs together. So I can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So SETsquared Exeter is a member of the SETsquared partnership, and the partnership, which was formed in 2002, is a collaboration between 5 research intensive universities across the south of England. So along with Exeter, we are joined by Bath, Bristol, Southampton and Surrey. And we within the partnership share best practice around 3 key areas of activity, those being student entrepreneurship, research commercialisation and business acceleration. Locally, to their own institutions, each partner delivers training and support services for students, staff and private organisations, and the central partnership team then coordinates a range of activities that are designed to enhance and extend the support for the more advanced participants within each of those stages from within the partner universities programs. And can we push on a slide, please? You can't talk to anyone from SETsquared for too long without seeing a slide a little bit like this. Over the lifetime of the partnership, as a group, we've worked with several thousand businesses providing business acceleration support services, and you get a sense of the scale of impact that we've been able to have on their growth and employment and the impact on the region, on the UK economy. And since 2001, the partnership has been named by the UBI Global organisation as the global #1 university business incubator. We're helped by the fact that we are 5 universities, but even so, I think that it's a good recognition of the longevity and quality of support that SETsquared has been able to deliver to an enormous range of businesses. Thank you. Can we move on? So to give you a sense of how the partnerships program of support hangs together, at a partnership level, as I suggested, these the SETsquared delivers a range of programs to which local university participants can apply to join in. At the student enterprise level, these include hackathons, weekend-long hackathons, as well as a graduate business-focused investment pitching event. And we've recently launched the iKeep program, which offers undergraduate and postgraduate students, including researchers, the opportunity to develop entrepreneurial competencies and apply them through placements, entrepreneurial experience. Obviously, we're talking about today really focuses on the research commercialization and moving forwards. And the SETsquared partnership has delivered the Researcher to Innovator program, which looks to help early career researchers develop their entrepreneurial competencies and consider how they might go about commercializing their research, introducing some of the approaches to considering a startup and its potential value. Tori's already mentioned the iCure program. This was originally developed by the SETsquared partnership before being adopted by Innovate UK for a national rollout. And so we're quite experienced in working with researchers who are carrying out the market discovery activity to understand the appetite for their research and how that can be applied in a commercial environment. And then we move towards the business acceleration support, and that starts with the entrepreneurs program. So for early stage ventures wishing to access the business acceleration programs, the entrepreneurs program is an intensive 3-morning online program currently that enables participants to thoroughly examine and test their business model, and for those that can demonstrate the growth potential of their organization, the opportunity is then to join one of the business acceleration centers across the partnership. And within that business acceleration activity, SETsquared coordinates an annual investment program. And we also deliver a scale-up program that looks at how consortia of larger businesses, SMEs, and researchers can collaborate to attract R&D funding. Can we move on, please? So locally, the SETsquared Exeter team deliver a range of entrepreneurship and startup support across that journey. That begins with our student startup team, who work delivering extracurricular venture creation support to students, but also to staff. And I think the key differentiation here is that primarily the student startup team work with new ventures where the university doesn't have an intellectual property interest. But many of the competencies that we are helping people to develop at that level are common across the whole program. Within the startup support, we deliver a pre-incubator program to help people consider the problems that they're trying to solve and how to build new ventures around those. And we provide a level of seed funding as a grant to help people research those activities and then launch. We also work closely with colleges across the university, providing co-curricular activity within master's programs and undergraduate programs to help people consider the entrepreneurial skills and how they can be translated into all disciplines. We also work very closely with Neil, Tori and Jim within the research commercialization activity, particularly to help people develop the understanding of the sort of entrepreneurial language and the competencies expected within that startup journey, and enabling people to get the most out of programs such as the Researcher to Innovator or iCure program. And at this stage, I think what is really critical is that the researchers consider their personal goals. What are you trying to achieve via a startup to commercialize your research? Because understanding those goals will really help define the pathway of support and the requirements that you have from organizations such as SETsquared and the university. What's really critical at this point is to think about the skills required to deliver a spin out or a startup and the time commitment required. I think it's important to recognize that launching a small business is a pretty much full-time activity if you want to do it in an accelerated fashion, and not everybody has the skill set required to lead a startup. And so quite a lot of what happens at its early stages is trying to help build relationships with more experienced entrepreneurs and business people who can provide mentorship support and potentially come on board to support the early stages of that business. But the principal activity of SETsquared Exeter is really around the business acceleration program. And through that, we connect comprehensively across the regional innovation ecosystem, working with networks and sector groups to provide specialist support and facilities. And as part of the business acceleration program, we deliver the Foundations Accelerator, which provides specialist business support and advice from a range of in-residence partners and mentors to ensure that organizations are equipped with to start their businesses. And just to sort of highlight the sort of entrepreneurial competencies that we're talking about, really is to understand the commercial imperative, to look at how you are creating value, who experiences that, how it is delivered, what the cost of creation is as opposed to the value, and develop effective business models that, particularly from a research commercialization perspective, really look at creating a market pull rather than a technology push approach. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So business acceleration programs across the SETsquared partnership have a number of common features. These include access to mentors, connection to the local professional services organizations, and access to what we refer to as entrepreneurs in residence, experienced entrepreneurs and business people who provide one-to-one dedicated support to our member businesses. And each centre also delivers business review panels on a regular basis, asking our member organisations to present to a board-style group to demonstrate their progress over the previous period and lay out their plans for the coming period. So in Exeter, the programme itself is headquartered at the Science Park Centre, where in the new year we'll be launching a newly developed co-working space. Obviously the demand for that sort of space is pretty low at the moment, but we have over the past few months transitioned all of our support delivery to an online format, so we can continue to work with businesses during lockdown. And if we could click on, please. So just to give you an idea of the Foundations program delivered by the Accelerator team, it's split largely into two key areas of activity: the fundamentals stream, which works with our advisors in residence. Now, these are senior partners from local professional services firms covering legal, accounting, insurance, IP, and important aspects such as R&D tax relief, and working with Business West to support applications for grant funding. Alongside the fundamental stream, we deliver the strategy and skills stream, which is delivered by our entrepreneurs in residence, and that really looks at the business skills and activities delivered by the majority of our clients. So looking at strategy, finance, product roadmaps and innovation, and investor readiness. And alongside these programs, which are delivered over the course of a year or a year and a half, member businesses can also access action learning groups and are able to apply for grants, which can part fund the short-term appointment of experienced executives into their business to undertake specific projects or activities in order to help the business scale up. Now, full membership of the SETsquared program is charged at £150 a month, which I would suggest is excellent value. But there are reduced rates for spin-out and startup ventures coming from campus. And we currently have funding from UKRI that enables us to offer an initial 6 months of membership at no cost. So, it creates a very low bar to enter such a comprehensive program. If I could click on, please. Thank you. Now, a key aspect of almost all of our members' journeys includes raising private investment. We include investor readiness as one of the key aspects of the Foundations program. And I mentioned earlier the annual SETsquared investment program, which provides an opportunity for up to about 20 businesses drawn from across the partnership to pitch for investment from an invited audience of angels and corporate investors. As you'll see here, this annual event has been incredibly successful in helping our clients to raise their early investment rounds. And in recent years, we've seen presentations from a number of Exeter spin-outs, which have included Simpleware and Philippe, who you heard from earlier, also Olivia Champion from Biosystems Technologies, and last year, Conor McKeever from spin-out Max LLG pitched to the audience to great effect. Can we click on, please? And this brings us to the scale-up program, which, if you remember from our earlier slide, really is at the right-hand end and helps the SETsquared partnership to connect with larger scaling businesses. And we do that through building consortia who can bid for collaborative R&D projects. And this presents another opportunity for researchers to expand their network and build connections within industry. The consortia that the Scale Up program aims to build includes large companies, SMEs, and researchers. And the Scale Up program can offer grant funding to afford grant writers to come in and produce really strong applications for large-scale funding. Increasingly, the drive from the Scale Up program is to look at multi-institutional funding, working with partners from across the SETsquared partnership, as well as Cardiff University. And if we click on. And the Scale Up program as it attempts to build these consortia and make connections with the various partners, can enable access to high-profile industry events, roundtable discussions, and opportunities which I think David referred to earlier of being able to go fishing in quite specific ponds and give researchers the opportunity to showcase their technology or the results of their research to an industry audience and make those connections and partnerships that could be fruitful in the future. The Scale Up program is focused across 4 key areas of activity, those being digital innovation, health and well-being, environmental, sustainability, marine and maritime, and advanced engineering and manufacturing. So quite a broad range of areas that we'd be really keen to hear from researchers within. If you go on to my last slide, please. So thank you very much for your time this lunchtime. The opportunity is there for you to connect at any level within the SETsquared Exeter partnership. The student startup team is led by Emily Davies. Ben Voisey, who is a chemistry PhD from Bristol and has run his own medtech startup, leads our business acceleration team. And Zilka Thomas heads up the scale-up program locally. But if you have any other more general questions, I'll be here for the Q&A kicking off in a second, and would welcome an email from anyone who's got any further questions. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Joe. That's a great introduction to all the programs that SETsquared can offer. So we'll move on now to a Q&A session. So we've got a few coming through in the chat. So the first one is addressed to you, Tori, and the question is does the University of Exeter own all IP from all employees? And what about IP unrelated to field and role employed by the university? That's a tough question to begin with.
Thanks. Indeed, the university does own any IP that is created by its employees. So if, for example, there's some research funding that, I don't know, that you get to work on an enzymology project, any IP that is arising from that would be owned by the university. I think, however, if you were to do something wacky like, I don't know, create a board game in your spare time, that doesn't relate to the research project. So I think being sensible, being open, talking to the university, there's routes that, there's arrangements that can be put in place. But broadly, yes, you're employed to be innovative as a researcher, therefore the university would own the outputs of that, in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, Tori. Yeah, I think the short answer to this one is it's quite a complicated position and quite a complicated area of law. So the best thing is come and talk to us and we'll help you work through that. Okay. So moving on to the next question. I think there's a lot of questions for you, Tori, I'm afraid, going through here. So there's a question here about how do you manage tension between public funded research, where ideas are published for collective benefit, and protecting IP for commercial exploitation?
That's a really good question. It's always a balance. And obviously that's why it's really important to consider that when you're writing your grant applications for funding, to work with us and help us help you. You know, if there is something commercially viable, the research funders also want to see that. But if societal benefit or the impact would be greatest if, for example, something was put as open source, then absolutely, it's a balance. And the university is a charity. We have a mission to ensure all of our research outputs are translated and commercialized in the most effective way, and that might not always be for commercial gain, but it could be for societal gain.
Okay, thank you. So I guess the next question is really for David and Tori, and it relates to internal funding and what the internal funding can be used for. Part of the question is about, can the internal funding be used to fund patents research resulting from research? So David, do you want to have a go answering this one first?
I'm not sure if I do. I think that's probably better start with Tori, isn't it?
It is, but perhaps you could say a little bit more about what the broader ranges of internal funding could be used for.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few good examples would be the MRC, CIC, and some of the accelerator funding mechanisms, and they are designed really to take those project ideas to that next step, where the results and evidence that you are generating through that investment is teeing up the project for the next phase of translational investment, if that makes sense. And along that pathway, it could be used to do a number of different things. I know that we have seen applications which advance further investigation into evidence. We've seen monies being used to understand the market landscape. So it can be used in a number of different areas. But I think in reference to patents, then that is definitely one for Tori to answer.
Yeah, so perhaps Tori come in on the specific element about patents.
Indeed, yeah. So we do have a pot of funding that's centrally held by the university to fund patents, but you can supplement that with, for example, certain funders and allow you to apply for money within your application that pay for patent costs. So, for example, the NIHR, you can build in a patent budget with them, but most UKRI funders expect that the university covers the cost of patents. So we do have a central budget for that. Joe, did you want to say something there?
I was actually wanted to come in on the earlier point about the sort of the tension between commercialization and working perhaps for more societal benefit. And I think I would suggest that there is still benefit to establishing an organization and looking at protection for ideas, but the opportunity is there to work as a CIC or a B Corp, or to establish a venture structure that continues to enable that societal benefit to be felt, and not to think of the entrepreneurial journey as a digital one, where you're either going for the sort of the highly capitalized business model of the examples that people sort of leap towards of Facebook or Google, but actually you can establish a venture that will require a similar sort of support that is much more focused on community or societal benefit from the research.
Okay, great, thanks Joe. So I've got a couple further questions for Joe now. So the first one, Joe, is going back to your slide where you talked about entrepreneurial competencies. Could you just expand a little bit on that, and perhaps also touch on what are the personal qualities and competencies that might be needed to be developed by would-be entrepreneurs?
Absolutely. I think the experience of starting a business, and particularly a business which you have aspirations for high growth, investment, and a sort of commercial exploitation, is a particularly challenging activity, and it requires the ability to deal with quite a high level of ambiguity and risk. It requires a huge amount of commitment, and it does require a lot of energy in order to see that journey through. It's in starting something like that, you're really setting yourself on a path that has a probable timescale of 3 to 5 years at the very least. Now you look at Philippe's journey, which took a slower pathway and was largely an organically grown organization in the early period, and that was a 20-year journey. So understanding the time requirements is a really big part of it, and I think recognizing your own personal preferences about how you'd like to spend your time is key. It's not as straightforward as sort of patenting and then waiting for the money to roll in. If you want to transition from being a researcher to a founder, it does require quite a change in lifestyle and what you carry out day to day.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So I see we've got about another 8 or 9 minutes before the break. So Joe, another quick question for you, which relates to spin-outs. is, do SETsquared and IIB typically take an equity stake in spin-outs if they've helped get them off the ground?
No. I think at the moment, certainly not. The services we provide to our members are at no equity cost. We are an independent business support provider, and our objective is to support the growth aspiration of our founders. We don't take any equity stake.
So if I could just come in there and clarify then that what actually happens with spin-outs is the university will take an equity stake in return for putting the intellectual property into the business. So it's very much related to the intellectual property rather than the broader support package that we provide around that. Next question. So I think, Tori, this is probably for you. Philippe Young mentioned it's better for the spin-out to companies who own the IP. What's the best way to achieve this, or how do we achieve this?
That's another good question. So Exeter is very mindful of that. So quite a few investors are keen to only invest if they are confident that the IP will eventually be an asset owned by the company, the spin-out company. So Exeter appreciates this and understands that position, and we're happy to negotiate assignment triggers. So initially the IP will be licensed into the spin-out company exclusively for equity, as Neil says, but upon raising a certain amount of money or the company receiving over and above a certain amount of revenue, we're happy to then assign the patent or patents into the company to give investors that peace of mind.
Okay, that's great. I'm getting lots of IP questions at the moment. So another one for you, Tori. If a method or idea is published in a journal, is the IP then in the public domain and open to exploitation by anyone?
Good question. So ideally, we prefer you to come and talk to us before you publish, because at that point we can then protect the IP that will be owned by the university. And that's, as I said in the slides, gives Exeter the monopoly right to exploit the IP. If, however, it's published, then yes, it is in the public domain. That then precludes us from patenting that invention. There might be other mechanisms, though, to exploit it. So we could still look at know-how or copyright, for example. If, let's say, we didn't file a software patent, but we still owned the code and the algorithms underpinning that, we could still exploit that through copyright license or consultancy to commercialize the know-how. But it is a balance. It's absolutely a balance. And I appreciate there is a challenge in how far we can go before you wish to publish your research. But I do implore you to come and talk to us and we can advise. Neil, is there anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think maybe the key point to add here is that whilst if something's been published, it is accessible to everyone. On the other hand, one of the key things investors or anybody who's going to put the money in to develop an idea to take it forward are looking for is something that's going to stop somebody else just copying that. And if there's no protection around that, then it becomes much harder to secure funding to take your idea forward. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword from that perspective. Okay, so we've got one last question, which is there a contradiction between protecting IP early, i.e. before publishing, presenting at conferences, and using those processes to actually develop the IP? Surely IP that's worth protecting comes from the scientific process of publishing, sharing, discussing, etc. Where do you draw the line? So, Tori, perhaps you'd like to just finish us off with a comment about that.
Indeed, yeah. So that is absolutely a challenge, certainly in academia. To give you the balance in industry, you would continue to do your R&D internally, secretively, and only file a patent when your product is effectively de-risked sufficiently. Whereas, yes, in the university setting, in academia, there is that challenge of, I want to publish, I want to present my work at conferences, I want to engage with my peers. However, it's just the nature of patent law that we must protect the invention before any public disclosure. So it is truly a balance of filing a patent early, but trying to balance with the need to publish. So if there can be a compromise found, to perhaps do 1 or 2 more killer experiments to get proof of concept, file the patent and then publish, then that's the happy medium, which is why I say come talk to us. We see this daily with all of our different inventions, so genuinely it's really worthwhile you speaking to us as soon as you can.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Tori. So, as we've heard, IP can be quite a complex and legally challenging area for us to navigate our way through, which is why we have access to the teams of experts within the universities to help you on that journey. So, again, just to encourage anybody to come and talk to us at whatever stage they're at, so we can provide you some further advice. So I'd just like to finish by thanking our 3 speakers from this session. So David, Tori and Joe, thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, I'm sure they'll welcome you getting in touch after the event. But that brings this session to a close. So we now have a lunch break and we'll be starting again at 1:15. Thank you very much.